This is the IDP After Show.
Hey all, it's time for yet another episode of the IDP After Show with me, Jase Abbey. We're already heading into week 13 and really, where's the season gone? Anyway, fear not, we're back to help you get prepared for the slate of games ahead from an IDP perspective. And you'll be elated, no doubt, to hear that I'm welcoming yet another excellent guest onto today's show. And they don't come any more excellent than Tripp Brebner, aka Dynasty Tripp, Dynasty and IDP writer and ranker at Footballguys. Tripp, I've really been looking forward to this one. Welcome aboard, and I should say happy Thanksgiving, my man.
Well, thanks, Jase. I appreciate the well wishes and appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk football with you. So I'm sorry to hear you're going through a normal Wednesday, but I wish you well in it and good luck to get into the weekend.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that weekend, that's for sure. But no, the pleasure's all mine. Really good to have you on. So yeah, let's do this. So as always on the show, Tripp and I are going to nominate 4 linebackers, 4 defensive linemen, 4 defensive backs who we predict are either going to be a hit or not in week 13. But Tripp, let's briefly touch on a general talking point. I feel like we sometimes forget how many injuries occur every season, and each year we gripe. I do the same. I'm no better than the next man over. We gripe about injuries to our key starters, right? But injuries happen all of the time, as they have this year. But what we have seen this year, especially at the king of IDP positions, that being linebacker, is more trades of noteworthy players, guys winning and losing roles. It's been kind of all over the place. All of this kind of makes me wonder, and a question for you here really is, should this affect our approach to roster construction at all? What do you think?
It really reinforces my opinion on roster construction, especially when it comes to linebacker. It can be such a fungible position. We saw Ernest Jones traded twice in the year, which was insane to see. And not only was he traded twice, but he lands on his feet each time. I mean, think of somebody out there who's been laid off from IT or whatever role. I mean, do they really land on their feet twice? And if they have a 3-month span, I mean, that's kind of amazing when you think about it. But then the wake of those effects with Tyrell Dodson being landing in Miami, and we still not 100% sure he'll land in a full-time role there. It looks like it, but Jerome Baker being bumped around, and then the ripple effect behind Ernest Jones in Los Angeles really still hasn't completely settled out. So that's been a hard thing to monitor. But my attitude on linebacker is one that I think is probably not popular in IDP circles. I think people are content with tackle production, content with volume, and I think that they underestimate the value of good play. I don't know if that is necessarily the case for Ernest Jones. He may be a good enough player, but it sets, who knows what's going on behind the scenes there. But when you see players like Tyrell Dodson, who didn't profile as a full-time player, who wasn't necessarily signed to play full-time. Jerome Baker was signed to play full-time, if you read the headlines from the spring. And then so Dodson finds himself, the first game that Jones was there, bumped over to Will, and then out the door the next week. And I had an article, and I thought about writing him up as a fade, rest of season outlook a couple weeks ago. And I didn't have I don't know if it's the courage or the risk averse nature to do it. Or just it got to be midnight and I said, it's time to wrap it up and go to bed. but it just goes to show you that these kind of just, replacement level players can be such a risk, especially in the second and third levels of the defense, that it just doesn't make sense to invest a lot of resources in them, especially in the dynasty world. And so I think your point is interesting, but it really just reinforces my approach.
So your approach is to go top heavy, go with the elite guys, don't take chances with that maybe that third tier. I was going to say second, but third seems more appropriate in this, in terms of what you were saying, in the context of what you were saying. These guys can be replaced, will be replaced, and we see it every season, right? Is that kind of a fair summary of what you're saying there?
Well, I think really what I see something that's interesting in IDP that's different than offense is something that's notable. If you look at offense and you look at like the top overall player at each position, whether it's Jefferson or Chase and at wide receiver, and then, Breece Hall or John Robinson at running back in Dynasty, what you'll see is that there's kind of a fairly slow slope in terms of you drop down a couple levels if you're looking at, at wide receiver, you're looking at Lamb or Gibbs, you'll see not a big drop off. What you'll see in IDP, in my opinion, is a huge drop off from the top overall player at each position to the third or so position, which I find fascinating. So I find that to be an interesting value point. And then you get down into the LB2s. That's where it starts to get messy. People have this idea that a player is a valuable asset in Dynasty, even though he's like a LB2. Maybe he's like a decent player, but not great. Those players, especially if they put up a big volume season, you think over the years of guys like Blake Bartitas and Jalen Smith and all the guys that have put up big seasons, and then a couple of years later they're out of league. It's really fascinating. And so for me, I think those are the guys that really present the greatest risk at linebacker. I don't worry as much at defensive end. I mean, we see guys, Bob, even if they change teams, generally speaking, a good pass rusher is a good pass rusher. But when it comes to linebacker, it's just those roles, those full-time roles. And that's why there are columns devoted to it on the IDP show and at Footballguys and elsewhere. You see in weekly columns keeping you apprised of who the full-time players are, because it's so important. And people I don't know if people appreciate how fleeting that role can be for a player who's not really a really good NFL player. And so the production may look okay, but then you realize, well, that player wasn't actually that good. He was just out there full time on a mediocre team. And next thing you know, he's lost his job because an Ernest Jones came available and they made a trade.
Yeah, no, I see your point. It's an interesting perspective. I kind of fall in line with the same kind of sort of way of thinking, I suppose. The injuries, the trades, what we've seen this year doesn't change my opinion at all. We can't predict who's going to get traded. I couldn't have predicted, Jones was going to get traded a couple of times, or Dodson. Nobody could have seen that coming, really. And the injuries, again, you really can't predict that stuff. So why would it change my perspective? There's still only 40 or so guys playing 90% or more snaps each week, full-time linebackers, if we want to call them that. The position scarcity means that I'm still going to target these guys. It depends on the league I'm in. If I'm in a league where I think that I can be first to the post to grab the guys who are, I think, going to be coming in and stepping in and taking the other guy's job, then I will decrease the value of linebackers when it comes to constructing my roster. But more often than not, we're in leagues. We're probably in a couple of leagues together, Tripp, where the next guy over knows exactly as much as you do, and if you don't get it right from the outset, you're kind of screwed when the season gets underway, because everyone's going to be targeting the same guys. So it's an interesting one, and I'm interested to hear your side of things. And my view as well is it doesn't really change my opinion of it. So with that said, Tripp, are you ready to dig into these nominations of ours? Because I want to kick things off with a position we were just talking about, linebackers. So will you tell me who you think has a shot to come up big in Week 13 at the linebacker position, and why?
Absolutely. Well, this fits right into the previous question, in that my approach on linebacker is that if I'm not buying these LB2, LB3 types, I'm buying the guys as cheaply as I can. If I don't have those high-end guys, then it's just, how can I backfill my roster with guys that that I can beat? You mentioned, can I beat them to the punch on my league mates? I don't know, not always. I try to play the good competition. So, but a guy here that John Macri and I talked about in the Bounce Back podcast over the summer was Mack Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals. So this is a guy that's started off the season playing half to 2/3 of snaps, but his role fairly quickly grew, and the Cardinals haven't necessarily played any full-time linebackers. Well, they're playing the Minnesota Vikings this week, and the Vikings have really had an advantage playing 12 personnel this season. And with TJ Hawkinson back, they're going to be playing more 12 personnel, which means that we're going to see two linebackers on the field for the Cardinals. If you look at Mack Wilson's recent resume, you think, really, that guy? He has 8 total combined tackles over the last 3 weeks. But one of the unsung stories of the 2024 season has been the Cardinals defense. The Cardinals have only allowed 1 offensive touchdown in that 3-week span. Their defense with no impact pass rushers, with not much at cornerback, has been remarkably effective. And it's not a storyline anybody's really talking about it. And their defense is kind of unique too, with some of their 3 safety looks. But Jalen Thompson is probably out this week. So we're looking at Mack Wilson playing a healthy role against the against the Vikings, a team that generally tends to feed push the ball into the middle of the field, and is generally a positive matchup for linebackers. So I think Mack Wilson plays closer to 90% of the snaps this week, and he also has pass rush snaps chops, which is really kind of how we got back on the radar last year, is playing some edge for the Patriots, and earned himself a contract with the Cardinals and came back from the dead. I mean, nobody heard from him since like 2019 when he was a rookie, and this year he's suddenly back on the radar. So I'm interested to see what he can do this week. And so for me, he's a guy that's probably on waiver wires in shallower leagues. If you're only playing two linebackers every week, my guess is that Mack Wilson is on your waiver wire. If you're playing 3 or 4, maybe he's at the back end of your roster. But that's I find that he could be an impact player against the Vikings in a game that should be more even than the Cardinals have played over the last couple of weeks, with more pace and more opportunities for tackles. And I would say in closing, the two is that my approach on this start in general is just that we want to try to recommend guys that we think could come out of the blue and make an impact. I mean, I don't think it does listeners a lot of good to say, let's start Myles Garrett. I don't like Myles Garrett's matchup this week, but he's Myles Garrett. You start him. If you're wondering about Roquan Smith and Nick Bosa, check the injury report. If they're active, they go. It doesn't matter if they're questionable. You just stick them in there. So I'm trying to find guys who are at the fringes of roster consideration that might be a value to listeners. So I hope that's some use.
Yeah, and he is. He is one of those guys that is on the fringes of rosters because, as you pointed out, the production hasn't quite been there. Now, are the Vikings a good enough matchup for him to emerge from that sort of funk that you talked about in terms of his tackle production? I hope so. I've talked down about Wilson in previous episodes, at least once. I think only once actually, because of that lack of production. And what I find jarring with him, or have found jarring with him, is that he has enough snaps, or has had enough snaps in recent games, as you pointed out, to be more productive than he has been. And that's a kind of a difficult pill to swallow when you do insert him into your lineups, because you see he's getting 80% of the snaps and then he returns with 3 tackles. I find that hard, especially when I see that, in consecutive weeks, as has been the case recently. But like you say, he does rush the passer quite a lot. He hasn't had a lot of success in that regard in terms of getting home, but maybe he can this week. And that makes him an interesting selection for me. And like you say, that Vikings matchup, maybe this is where he can emerge from this like funk that he's in and like just deliver, because that would be nice to see.
Yep.
So my guy is Bobby Okereke this week. He gets my shout. And, everyone was kind of down on him to start the season. You know this, right? He did very little, didn't even eclipse like 5 solo tackles until week 8, which we think back to the player we saw last year, just seems really bizarre. Especially when, this year everyone was like drafting him super high because of what he did last year. He was seen, there wasn't much competition in on the Giants roster in terms of linebackers that could kind of surpass him and become that every down guy. Okereke was that man, right? So to see him start the year as he did for almost half a season and do next to nothing was really hard. But last 4 games he's taken off, hasn't he? 41 combined tackles, a sack, 2 forced fumbles. We talked about matchup earlier on in Mack Wilson's case. In Okereke's case, he's facing the Cowboys this week. They were already an above average matchup for opposition linebackers in terms of tackle volume when Dak Prescott was in at quarterback. And now that Cooper Rush is in, they've become an even better matchup. So I think that Okereke can kind of again, just keep it going. I know he's been kind of overshadowed by Micah McFadden in terms of tackle efficiency over the course of the season, but going back to our earlier point, our opening point, in fact, I'm pretty much always going to be taking the guy that gets the most snaps. I know we're only talking sort of like 10 snaps between the two of them now at this point in the season, but Okereke definitely gets my nod. Where do you sit on this one?
Well, I agree with you on Okereke. It was oddly puzzling to see how low his production was earlier in the season, and I don't really have a better explanation than just to say that this is a small sample size sport. If you're in baseball and you play fantasy baseball, after 100 games, you know what you got. We're here 12 weeks deep into the season, and it sounds like a lot of games. It's really not. It's in the general scheme of things, it's just you can see guys come up small 3 or 4 weeks in a row, and there aren't really good explanations for it. I really think that's the case with Okereke. went back and watched a little bit of that game film, and it's not obvious to me why he's not in the mix on some of those things. And I think that his more recent tackle production is more representative of the Giants defense and his role in that defense and his abilities as a player, which I don't think he's the world's best linebacker, but he certainly was effective last year. And there's no reason why he can't put up 10 tackles against Cowboys.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you. I don't think he's superb. He's a lot better than I think he was in his early year or his early career at the Colts. Some guys just seem to suit a scheme a little better, and I think he has improved. but yeah, I'm rolling with him this week. No, not even looking back on that one. So Tripp, which linebacker do you think is going to disappoint this week?
Well, I've got a highlight on Jordan Hicks here. So I think folks are looking at Jordan Hicks and thinking, what are the Browns going to do? There's got to be an answer, a full-time linebacker after Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah went on to IR. And the answer is Jordan Hicks, which probably isn't a huge surprise. It's a guy that was signed and we expected to play a valiant role when he came into the season, but he got banged up. Returned after JOK went on to IR, and over the last couple of weeks has played full-time. His tackle production hasn't really been there, but he did get a sack, which is attractive. He had 2 tackles for loss, and folks watched him on prime time against the Steelers, and he was impactful in that game. I think maybe folks are like, well, let's run out and grab him. But yeah, I don't love his matchup against the Broncos this week. The Broncos are oddly, puzzlingly poor matchup for linebackers, in no small part because they've been really poor running the football. It's just Javonte Williams had like 8 carries for 0 yards last week, I think, which I can't quite explain either. Maybe I need to get better at this football analysis thing. But as a result, I just don't like Jordan Hicks's prospects in a week where, like you said a minute ago, normally you do want those guys to play full time, but man, if you've got another full-time linebacker you can pivot to, I think you do it this week.
Yeah, this is a tough one for me because I do like Jordan Hicks. Not necessarily this week, and I'll get into why, but I like him as a player. I think he is still able to have impact games. I actually picked him as my like last week, but I picked him as my like predominantly on the basis that he was playing the Steelers, and the Steelers have been a really good matchup, one of the best, I think, in terms of tackle volume, at least for opposition linebackers. This week, as you pointed out, the Broncos, they've been one of the worst. So yeah, I like him as a player, but I agree with your choice in terms of selecting him this week as your linebacker to fade for that reason alone. Now for me, and this is it's kind of like sad that I want to say this, but Trevin Wallace is my fade at linebacker for week 13, and this is predominantly based on a reduction in his snap share Trip. He was playing every down in the absence of Josey Jewell, remained in that sort of high 80s snap share range in the first few games after Jewell returned, but that's kind of dropped to below 70% in each of the 2 games since. I could have lived with that maybe last week with, 6 teams on a bye. This week, every team's involved again. We're not stuck for choice at linebacker, or not as much as we would be in other weeks, certainly not as last week. So yeah, that's kind of like, it's enough to make me want to fade him. Ordinarily, that would be enough to justify him still, though, as an LB3 if he was playing around about 65-70% of snaps. But this week, as I say, no teams on a bye. The Panthers face the Bucs. The Bucs have been a below-average matchup for opposition linebackers in volume and efficiency. They have improved, I will say, as a matchup in the last few weeks, but it's just not enough to change my mind about Wallace. So, yeah, I'm kind of fading him. Now, I should point out, if it wasn't clear, that there are many more obviously worse choices out there than Wallace in this category. But like you said earlier on, Tripp, I wanted to choose a player who, people might be tempted to start, and I think he falls into that category. Are you any more optimistic about his outlook than I am?
Well, I'm with you. I think that's one thing that folks sometimes lose track of a little bit, is that these declines in snap share. They don't realize that he's not playing full time anymore now that Josey Jewell is back. So I think it's a good point to raise. And yeah, this is the kind of guy where he's at the fringes of starting consideration. And I think if you have a Mack Wilson, I think Mack Wilson is a better choice than Trevin Wallace this week. So yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, and as I say, I hate to point it out because I've got a load of him basically in various leagues, and in Dynasty, I'm kind of liking what I'm seeing long term, but yeah, not for this week.
And he's a rookie, right? You got to give him time to develop, and so the Panthers are out there. They intended to start Shaq Thompson, who can't stand the field, and Wallace is sort of forced into action, and they don't need to play him full time. So why? So it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not knocking at all what they're doing. I'd do the same in their position. Right. Jewel is again, he's not great, but he's solid. I think Jewel. He's not going to be a huge letdown. Whereas Wallace is still learning his trade. Right. So it makes sense that they're doing what they're doing. I'm not complaining about it. I just I am from my from the perspective of my fantasy
100%. Yeah. We want everybody we draft to score 12 tackles a game and get it done for us.
Absolutely. So look, Tripp, let's talk about the big boys. Let's start with the players we like here. Which defensive lineman do you think is going to be in line for a big week in week 13?
Well, I've tabbed Dorance Armstrong this week at the Cowboys. He was a bit of a sleeper coming into the season. A lot of folks are highlighting him, and he statistically hasn't really lived up to that billing. And in fact, he's been outstatted by Dante Fowler, who plays on the opposite end. But the thing about Fowler is he's still playing less than Armstrong. Armstrong is the guy that's playing 70% of snaps, while Fowler plays closer to 50. And Fowler really hasn't been as, in terms of win rates and metrics in terms of off the line of scrimmage, he really hasn't been as productive as Armstrong. Armstrong's the same guy as he was last year. He's been a pretty good, not great player. He followed Dan Quinn from Dallas to Washington, and he's played reasonably well, and it just hasn't gotten home as often as Fowler has. This week, the Commanders play the Tennessee Titans, and they play Will Levis, who has the pocket presence of a tree stump, and he got hit. I don't remember how many sacks it was against the Titans last week. It's amazing that they won the game when he's out there getting sacked like 9 times, right? But there it is. And so he's bound to take some sacks this week as well. And Armstrong is the best candidate to do that. According to Footballguys scoring, the Tennessee Titans allow the typical defensive end to score that position to score 10 fantasy points more than that player would score against other opponents. It's just an astonishing gap. I mean, most positions you see the gap at 2, 3, 4 points. In this case, the Titans are allowing the position to score 10 points above its average against other teams. It's just a huge advantage. I mean, so you just can't help but want to plug in whatever pass rusher you have. I mean, if you have Fowler on your lineup, plug him in too. But Armstrong is the guy that I feel better about due to the volume and performance at the line of scrimmage at point of attack over the weeks.
Yeah, we had a brief chat off air before we came on. Said to you that I feel like I've probably alienated a lot of Titans fans by talking about Levis and any defensive lineman that have him in matchups in recent weeks. He's been sacked 20 times in the last 3 games, more than any other quarterback. I think Caleb Williams is like 15 in a second. So yeah, for now, yeah. Who's the right tackle they've got? Petit Frere.
Yeah, Nicholas Petitfrere.
Why are these guys still starting? There must be something better on the roster, right?
Well,
I don't know.
They tried, right? They signed Andre Dillard in free agency, and that crashed and burned. And they drafted Peter Skoronski in the first round and moved him to guard. And they keep trying.
Yeah,
blaming the game, I guess.
It must be infuriating to be a Titans fan to watch that problem exist, because he's been a problem in the past as well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it is what it is. But yeah, right there with you with this selection. I got temporarily really excited about Armstrong earlier in the year when he went on that little run of like 4 sacks in 3 games or 3 sacks in 2 games. Forget what it was now. Kind of like he was one of my kind of like low key sleepers because there wasn't a lot on that Commanders defensive line, certainly at the edge position anyway, after they traded away pretty much everyone. And so yeah, when they brought Armstrong in, I kind of like, yeah, this could be cool. He's been a bit part player in the Cowboys for a long time. It's going to be cool to see what he can do in a more of a featured role. He's kind of had that, as you said. The results, at least lately, have been a bit disappointing, but this is the matchup for him, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So, talking about really bad defensive or offensive tackles, a bad offensive tackle is largely the reason, or a couple of bad offensive tackles is largely the reason why I'm selecting this guy this week. And I've gone with Laiatu Latu. And I want to give a hat tip to, or at least mention that I've heard everybody talking about him in the last couple of days, and for good reason, right? He's been on fire lately. There's a lot in common this week with my selection of Latu as there was with my selection last week with Chop Robinson. Both rookies, both started slowly, both put together a hot streak in recent games. and both have or had, in Robertson's case, favourable matchups. It worked out with the Robertson selection. I think I quite fancy my chances that I've kind of repeated this week trip with Latu. 8 pressures, 2 sacks in the last 2 weeks. Just posted his best PFF pass rush grade of the season in a tough matchup as well. Looking ahead to this week, neither of those Patriots offensive tackles performed well. Viderian Lowe at left tackles allowed 14 pressures and 4 sacks in his last 4 games. DeMontre Jacobs at right tackle is an abomination. He's allowed 18 pressures and 3 sacks in his last 4. And it was him, obviously, who Robinson faced last week. So I'm kind of going back to the well. I know that he's kind of like lost a little bit of snap share with, in fact, that applies to Kwity Paye, Deo Odeyingbo as well, with the return of Tyquan Lewis. But I still feel like as the informed edge rusher on this Colts team, an informed player like Latu can take advantage of this matchup and be really productive. So do you also share my optimism with him this week, Tripp?
Well, you mentioned the Patriots offensive tackles. I'm thinking, man, it makes the Titans situation look okay, doesn't it? Like, what are the Patriots doing? I could never get that clip out of my mind when they drafted Cole Strange in the first round and Sean McVay was laughing. Like, man, we thought we might get him in the 3rd round. Poor Patriots, man. It's like, how the mighty have fallen. But I would just stress the concern that you mentioned with the rotation, right? If Tyquan Lewis is back, they're playing 4 guys, similar amounts of snaps. Deo Odeyingbo led the group in snaps last week. My Footballguys scoring was a bust, but he had 2 tackles for loss, 2 quarterback hits, and was a useful player. He's a guy that I wrote up a couple weeks ago. So there's certainly room for everybody to eat here. I guess that's my only concern is volume. But this is the game that the Colt. I wonder what the line is in this game. Do you know what the line is?
I don't. No,
I'm curious to know what Las Vegas thinks is going to happen. Like, is this a back and forth game? I mean, it feels like it should be a back and forth game, which, certainly the Patriots can't blow the Colts out. So, but with the amount of snaps that the Colts were playing earlier in the season, I wonder if we'll get back to that. If the Patriots if there's some tempo in this game, it could be enough for everybody to eat and be an interesting game for all the edges.
Yeah, absolutely. So, which defensive lineman are we fading this week? Who are you kind of cooling on in week 13?
Well, I was going to highlight who is Footballguys' top scoring defensive tackle in points per game, which is Calijah Kancey of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I always love to talk about defensive tackles, which I know not everybody uses defensive tackles in fantasy football. You should. It's like not playing tight ends on offense. Play defensive tackles, please. Give the big guy some love.
For sure.
But Calijah Kancey has 17 tackles. Only 2 assists in recent weeks, which is interesting, and he's had some success with sacks. He had 2 sacks in a game on primetime a couple weeks ago, and he wasn't blocked in either of those. Well, I might even be able to get a sack if I wasn't blocked. So I doubt it. I probably couldn't pull down an NFL quarterback who was 6 inches taller than me, but nevertheless, Kancey goes against the Carolina Panthers this week in Charlotte, and I think folks are going to say, "Whoa, that's a tasty matchup." Actually, no. The Panthers have stabilized in recent weeks. They revamped their offensive line, brought in a couple free agents to play guard, and that line has started to gel. In fact, they have an above-average protection rating and pass protection over the season, thanks to their recent improvement in that line improving. So they look like a disaster. The whole team did early in the season, right? But they've kind of been competitive lately. They gave the Chiefs a run for their money, and I don't know if they gave a run for their money, but they kept it close anyway. And Chris Jones didn't even stat against them. Chris Jones was disruptive. He just didn't quite get home. So I think that folks are going to look at that matchup and think Calijah Kancey, they're going to play downhill, easy start. I would caution folks against that. I'm not as excited about Kancey. I'm not ready to anoint him the next big thing as some folks in the IDP world are.
Interesting. I really like him in those leagues where sacks are rewarded handsomely, I will say, compared to some other defensive tackles. But I do that knowing that the floor is very low. You're not going to get a lot of tackles, I don't think, from a guy like him. Now, I also think that the interior of that Panthers line is probably a little bit worse than the bookends, the offensive tackles. I like Moton. I like who's the young guy whose name I forget now. Yeah. So I'm wondering whether yeah. I don't know if I'm right on board with this one, Tripp. This might be our first disagreement, you know.
Uh-oh.
Why
we talk through him, right?
Yeah. I do see him as, like I say, he's that guy that's going to get you. He's going to get you a sack who's going to do very little or nothing for you. But just lately, it's been kind of nice to watch him do what he's doing. So yeah, I do wonder if he's going to make some noise in this one. We'll have to wait and see. This is the one I'm going to watch now.
All right.
You know? And I will message you if I'm left with egg on my face, and you can be damn sure I'll message you if you're left with egg on your face as well.
There's a rub it in emoji on there on that app somewhere.
I'll find one. I'll definitely find one. But yeah, I kind of like him as a pass rusher. But again, in those leagues where maybe more balanced scoring or where tackles matter at all, then yeah, I could fade him. I am pumping the brakes on another young guy, Tyree Wilson. Now, I know that Addy's probably screwing his face up right now because I heard the guys on the Week 12 recap, IDP recap, talking about, how nice it is to see him produce lately. And I will say that in fairness, they were saying that, Addy was saying at least, he's going to be he's the kind of guy that you expected to kind of come into his own, maybe year 3, year 4. We need to be patient. He's kind of was never going to be an instant hit in the way that some of these other guys are. He just wasn't as ready as a Will Anderson type or, a Jared Verse or a Latu type, right? So in that sense, I can kind of understand exactly where they're coming from. But what I want to say, Chip, is I know that, people might be asking why I'm nominating him here on his recent production. 3 sacks in 4 games, very nice. I'm picking him up off waivers in dynasty leagues, deep dynasty leagues for sure, right? And I'm hoping that what we're seeing is the start of something good. But because it is nice to see that kind of production from a former first rounder, but that kind of production after being so quiet in the first sort of season and a half makes me a little worried. He's only managed 7 pressures over the last 4 games. That also makes me worried. Those 3 sacks, great, but on 7 pressures. I'm concerned that sort of efficiency, that sack to pressure efficiency is going to drop off a little bit. It's going to be hard to maintain. The Chiefs this week, right? They've got the Chiefs tomorrow night. Thursday night, isn't it? So Mahomes, they've been a tough matchup, I think, for defensive linemen for a long time. Now, that hasn't been the case this year. Mahomes has been sacked 15 times in the last 4 games alone. So I think the Raiders and specifically Max Crosby can find some degree of success in this one. But crucially, I don't think the scoreline will be as close as it has been in the Chiefs' other games. I think because of that, the Chiefs will be in a position where they're able to lean heavily on the run. And I think those opportunities to run the passer are going to be pretty limited. I think Wilson's going to be caught up in that, and I don't think he's going to be productive. I'm putting my neck on the line. I'm picking a guy who has been productive. There it is. What say you?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, this game is Friday, which I think is the first Black Friday NFL game in a very long time, if ever. Yeah. So it's appropriate that the silver and black play on Black Friday. The Chiefs are an interesting situation this year that you might have seen in the news that they just signed a DJ Humphries off the street, which is an acknowledgement that their left tackle situation is a mess. So that left tackle will face Tyree Wilson because the Raiders typically play more left and right. But Max Crosby will play left defensive end and therefore opposite the right tackle, which is Jawan Taylor for the Chiefs. And so whoever they play at left tackle, it's been Wanya Morris, but obviously there must be reconsidering that now. I don't think Humphries will be ready for this week, but Wanya Morris will be out there. They had a guy named Kingsley Sematueo or something play the first couple of weeks, and he was literally the league's worst offensive tackle in protection on an island over the first 2 weeks. It was replaced. Both the guys are young guys. Maybe they come around, but Wanya Morris was bullied by Jadeveon Clowney, which is how we came to where we are now with the Chiefs. And Clowney is a guy that's a little like Wilson in that Clowney's a lot older, but Clowney is a former first-round pick who never really developed that pass rush repertoire and has really succeeded by building offensive linemen. So if you look at Tyree Wilson's performance on the year, his worst games have come against Garrett Bowles, who's an older established veteran for the Broncos, a left tackle that's not a great player, but a good player, and is a cornerstone of that franchise the last couple of years. And then you look at Wilson's best games, and they come against Brown's backup defensive tackles, younger players that he was able to bully. And so I don't hate the matchup this week. And I'm not sitting here saying you ought to start him, because I think game flow is a serious problem, right? We expect that the Chiefs would control the ball, control the line of scrimmage. Aiden O'Connell comes back at quarterback for the Raiders. You wonder if that's going to be a shot in the arm at all. The Raiders were competitive against the Broncos last week. They did get the short passing game going. Jacoby Myers had 10 catches. But you got to imagine the Raiders are ready for it, and that the Chiefs are ready for it and have an answer. So I wouldn't recommend starting them, but I don't know if I'm as down on them as you are. And I would go along with what Addy said about his player development. He's kind of on a Trevon Walker track. Hopefully that's an optimistic take. Trevon Walker was the 101, and people are like, what? When Aiden Hutchinson, I think we talked about it. I think I was on a pod. I think we were all on the Big 3 IDP show podcast couple of years ago during the live draft. We all talked about, like, how would you pass up Aiden Hutchinson at 101 and go with Trevon Walker based on 5% additional athleticism? And Trevon and Tyree Wilson sort of the same, picked 7th overall based on glimpses of production, athletic ceiling, and it's just going to take a long time to come around. And so it's year 3, year 4 before this is a guy that you're probably comfortable starting. So just for a longer term value, it's really fascinating to hear you say that you're able to get him off waivers in deeper leagues. That's pretty remarkable that people are willing to give up on him that quickly. And that's actually the beauty of Dynasty League sometimes at defensive end, is that people will give up on pass rushers too quickly. They just take time to develop. You look at Trey Hendrickson, 29 years old, and he's really come to really taken another step this year and become one of the elite pass rushers of the league at age 29, which is fascinating to see. So Tyree Wilson has a long way to go. I'm not predicting he'll be Trey Hendrickson, but I'm fascinated to see if he can continue to develop this year. And so I wouldn't start him this week either. So I agree with you in that sense, but I think it's more nuanced than just, oh, he sucks, get him out of there.
Yeah, no, I get it. And I, just to be clear, I don't disagree with anything Addy said about his evaluation of Wilson as a player and his kind of like potential to become, an impactful player in the future. I'm not as enamored with the level of production, given how I don't think he's been as disruptive as I'd like him to be. If he'd had sort of 15 pressures and 3 sacks, I'd be like, yeah, but, if his win rate was great, I'd be like, oh, this is kind of cool. And even in a matchup against, like the Chiefs, which, isn't great. Like you said, maybe not as bad as I first thought, but yeah, I'm not starting him again. There's no teams on the bye this week. Edge is one of those positions where we kind of have, I feel like we've kind of got our rosters set for the most part, unless we've been struggling with injuries. I don't know about you. I'm kind of running 3-4. I'm looking at some of my like edge 4s, edge 5s. I'm like, yeah, these guys are good. They're just not producing. They're playing well. They're just not producing. Whereas I feel like Wilson is producing, but I don't think he's playing as well as some others maybe think he is. When you look at some of the underlying metrics, I guess is like what I'm saying in summary. So, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see. So let's keep an eye on that one as well. So, Tripp, let's talk some DBs. Which DB is going to have a big week this week?
Well, this is a blast from the past. The guy that tends to make a cameo every so often is Jonathan Owens, Simone Biles' husband, and he was impactful down the stretch last year. I'm in a 60-man, 20-team start a ton of players Dynasty League, and I cut Jonathan Owens at the beginning of last year because he wasn't starting, and someone picked him up, started him against me in the final, and I lost. So it still hurts.
I love it. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So Jonathan Owens reemerged last year because he's like the 4th or 5th man up in Chicago now. Jaquan Brisker looks like he might be out for the year with a concussion. He's on IR. Elijah Hicks was hurt last week, is hurt again this week, has been ruled out of tomorrow's game. And so Jonathan Owens gets another start. And what's fascinating about Jonathan Owens is that that in Chicago's defense, there's a bit of a differentiation in safety deployment. And so Jonathan Owens has been used as that guy that plays close closer to the line of scrimmage while Kevin Byard is playing deeper. And so Owens had 4 tackles, 4 assists, and forced a turnover in his game last week against the Vikings in the overtime thriller. This week they're playing the Lions. The Lions are a decent matchup for safeties. But I'm more interested in the fact that the Lions are probably playing downhill. They're running the football a ton. They've got a tight end that they like. Not as much this year, apparently. But nevertheless, I think that the opportunities are there. What's really fascinating about Owens is that in his limited action this year, he has an average depth of tackle in run defense of 1.7 yards, meaning he's basically playing at the line of scrimmage. For comparison's sake, Grant Delpit, who has been the perennial leader among full-time players in the stat of the last 3 years, is averaging 3.3 yards average depth of tackle in run defense. So it's just kind of crazy that Owens is like a de facto linebacker in there for the Bears. And I really like his opportunity to stack up tackles, trying to slow down David Montgomery if he plays, and Jahmyr Gibbs this week.
Yeah, I like this one. Popular waiver ad in those leagues where we're starting sort of 2-3 safeties or even less. In fact, he's jumped up from not playing at all pretty much to playing every down for the reasons you mentioned. So I've really got nothing to add to this one, to be honest with you. I'd be starting him. I like him. He's one of those guys that just does this, right? He disappears for long stretches, all of a sudden pops up and becomes super useful. Do you remember that? Was it start of last year or the year before where he started on an absolute tear? It was like double-digit tackles in like 3 out of the first. I forget the specifics now, but
2 years ago in Houston, Houston had a terrible defense. Lovie Smith was showing that his 2005 era defense didn't work anymore, and the linebackers were getting killed, and the safeties, Jalen Petrie and Jonathan Owens, were like the 2 leading tacklers at the position for the first 8 or 9 weeks of the season. It was bananas.
Yeah, it was great to see. It was kind of like the Quinton Lake of this year, but I guess Nick Ross kind of like bumped him down a little bit as the season unfolded. But yeah, I like this one. So for me, there are. This is going back to what we were saying earlier on, right? There's other more obvious DBs that I'm more confident in this week, but I'm liking how Christian Izien is trending, and that's because of an injury as well. Like Jordan Whitehead suffered a torn or at least a ruptured pectoral last week. It looked like he might have surgery. I saw earlier today that I don't think he is having surgery, but it's going to be season-ending nonetheless. Now, I don't think Izien is a like-for-like replacement for Whitehead, and the addition of Mike Edwards kind of muddies the water. It makes it a bit more difficult to predict who will step up. But Todd Bowles' comments on Izien were interesting. I've got his quote here. And the timing of it, I guess, Tripp is more interesting piece. He's probably the quickest one from A to B as far as getting when a quarterback is releasing the ball to when a receiver is catching it. He can take off right away. He's a very sure tackler that way. His vision is expanding. It's been very good for us to see the underneath coverage as well as the zone stuff back deep. He's excelled in coverage for us. And as I say, it's not just the comments, but the timing of the comments as well. Now, in week 12, we saw Izien with his largest snap share of the season, 83%. Tied his season high of 9 tackles. The Panthers, the Bucs opponent this week, they haven't allowed many tackles to opposition safeties, but in the absence of Tyke Smith, who I saw was doubtful going into last week, questionable now, Izien has been the favoured option to play in that slot DB role. And the Panthers slot wide receiver, David Moore, has led them in targets in recent games. So I kind of think there's a good chance that Izien is kept busy in this one. Kind of depends how many sort of snaps he plays in the slot, which kind of depends on whether Tyke Smith comes back. So yeah, I'm kind of like I'm trending. I'm kind of like liking the way he's trending, I guess. But I'm keeping an eye on Smith's status.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of goes back to maybe the overarching theme of our selections here, which is that you don't want to put a lot of resources in your safety position. And if you haven't, then you probably get to this point in the season where you're looking for answers on the waiver wire. And this is an interesting one. Like you said, his role has grown in part due to injuries, but he has played effectively when he has had opportunities in his two-year career and has been efficient with those opportunities too. So if he gets more snaps, then he's an attractive option.
Yeah, for sure. So who do we dislike, Tripp, at DB?
Speaking back on the same theme, Coby Bryant of the Seahawks is my fade this week, and he's a guy that also folks would have picked up on the waiver wire probably a couple weeks ago by now. But he was on the highlight reels this past weekend because he had a pick six against Cardinals, and he also has some decent tackle production as well. But what folks may not be aware of is that the season opening starter Rayshon Jenkins is back from injury, played 50% of snaps this past week. It remains to be seen if Jenkins does in fact regain the position. Coby Bryant played nickel last year. Had a little bit of life there. Switched to safety because he couldn't hold up and an overhang role in a run defense, and so it's been playing predominantly deep, which is not usually a good thing for tackle production, which makes me uncomfortable. And then on top of that, I'm not loving the matchup this week, and so I think this may be one of those things where you've gotten him off the waiver wire, but he could be a flash in the pan, and I wouldn't be eager to start him this week. I think you've got to be careful about, it's easy to try to chase last week's stats, and this would be a risk with Coby Bryant. And so that being said, I don't know if I even love Julian Love that much, but I don't know how you bench him if you have him. But it's just the matchup. This makes me uncomfortable, and therefore Bryant is an easy fade, and maybe folks should watch out. And I should be careful about really the Julian Love, the other safety too, who is a regular starter.
Yeah, you're right to point out Jenkins coming back, and this isn't a three safety scheme. We know that, right? So. If Jenkins was being eased in a little bit and, he's going to be playing this week a little bit more, then fair enough. The only question I have really is Jenkins was really disappointing earlier in the season when he was starting, whereas Bryant has been playing a lot better. Not to say he's been playing really well. He's been playing pretty well, but not exceptionally well, but has been playing better than Jenkins. Do you think there's a chance that what we saw last week is what we might see going forward? And even if it is, I think the point I'd arrive at, I'm not like arguing the case with you. I'm just posing the question: why would we take the chance? Right? We're not stuck for like DBs. Again, no teams on the bye. DBs in general, there's like they're all over the place. There's loads of full-time DBs we can pick. But question is, do you think there is a chance? It would be interesting to see, right? If Bryant does retain that full-time role over the Jenkins who was so disappointing to start the year.
I do. I think there's a decent chance, actually. I think there's a chance that Bryant emerges as that regular safety in that defense and is back next year as the incumbent starter. He's on a rookie contract. It's always appealing for GMs to spend less at the safety position. And I can't bring up Jenkins's contract right off the bat, but I doubt they have a ton committed on him. I bet they wouldn't mind the idea of letting him go and cutting the losses there. So I was a bit struck by the Jenkins signing. He played more of a box role last year for Jacksonville, and the reason they parted ways with him is because they wanted somebody who they thought was more versatile. So they replaced him with Darnell Savage because they liked the nickel, the slot role. They felt like Savage would be able to play all three roles. Jenkins was playing deep safety for the Chargers years ago alongside Derwin James, and that's how he got a big contract in Jacksonville. Jacksonville took a look at it, said this guy is not a deep safety. So it's really interesting that Seattle picks him up with the idea that he's a deep safety again. And like you said, that hasn't really gone that well. So yeah, I could easily see a situation where Jenkins is permanently demoted into the third safety role. So I don't hate Bryant. I wouldn't cut him if you're in a deeper league where you've got you're able to hold safeties, but I'm just not eager to start him this week.
Got you. Yeah, I hear you. Just looked up Jenkins' contract situation. He is under contract next year, but with an $8 million cap number, and they can make $5.4 million of savings. So
yeah, that's done deal then. Yeah,
yeah. Maybe they continue to run with a bit of Bryant and see what he's got. Who knows? But yeah, again, why would you take the chance? I'm not disagreeing with you this week. My guy, Donovan Wilson. I've got to go with him here. I probably wouldn't mention him were it not for the fumble that he forced against the Commanders last week, but I saw him get picked up off waivers in one of my leagues where they processed earlier today, and I'm kind of concerned others might look his way too. For me, there's just too many red flags. He's had a really rough season. He's looked really poor in coverage. He's missed nearly 17% of his tackle attempts. That's like such a crazy high number. There are players with worse, I will say, but his tackle production's also been dreadful. It's not like he's in position to make loads of tackles and he's missing a bunch of tackles. He's just missing lots of tackles and he's not in position, right? So an 8.1% tackle efficiency rate doesn't really cut it for me. The most concerning thing for me, Tripp, though, is that in week 12, season low 69% snap share, ceding snaps to Juan Thomas, who had a season high 34% snap share. He's jumped quite sharply. So if those weren't enough reasons to fade Wilson, his matchup against the Giants is poor. It was a bad matchup for opposition safeties with Daniel Jones at QB, and it's if last week's game against the Bucs was any indication of what's to come, that looks kind of set to continue with DeVito, if DeVito plays this week, that is. So, yeah, I'm all the way out on Wilson. If that wasn't abundantly clear, Tripp, where do you sit on him?
I'm saddened by Wilson because, as you see from the hat here, I'm a Cowboys fan, and Dan Quinn seemed to get the best out of Wilson. Wilson was like, if I recall, he was like a 6th-round pick, and he seemed to emerge as a pretty useful player. And like, I remember years ago, Tom Kissling, Barry Duncan on the guys. He can't play box safety, and they're like, he actually did okay as a box safety under Dan Quinn. Well, now Dan Quinn's gone. Mike Zimmer's in there, and Donovan Wilson is one of a couple of players that has really struggled in the new scheme, and it's just not been effective. And like you said, he has lost reps. And yeah, you just if anybody's picking him up with the idea that they could start him, sorry, good luck.
Yeah. I was low key excited about him this year, moving away from that sort of 3 safety scheme we saw last year where no one was really playing every down to potentially this year playing in an every down safety role. The snap share has gone up, but the performances have dropped off. The efficiency, the production is not there. I don't see any reason to roll with him this year. This year? Yeah, this year. But also
this year. This week, this year. Yeah, just find somebody else.
Yeah, that's it. So look, Tripp, that sadly already is a wrap for this show, for the IDP After Show Week 13 preview episode. Let's recap these nominations. Your likes for Week 13 were... and correct me if I've got these wrong, Mack Wilson, Dorance Armstrong, Jonathan Owens. Mine were Bobby Okereke, Laiatu Latu, and Christian Izien. Your dislikes were Jordan Hicks, Calijah Kancey, Coby Bryant. Mine were Trevin Wallace, Tyree Wilson, and Donovan Wilson. Clearly, I hate all the Wilsons, right? So, there you go. Tripp, you, my friend, have knocked it out of the park tonight. It's been a joy to do this with you. I knew it would be. Thanks for coming on, my man. Now, I know you've been super busy this year, as always, pumping out quality content for IDP fans. But for those who are less familiar, please share a little bit about what you've been up to and where people can go to find your work.
Sure. Well, I appreciate it. It's great to come on and chat football with you. It's like, it's writing is fun, but it's fun to talk about it once in a while, right? You just got to get wound up and start talking, and it's cool. So I appreciate that. My work is over at footballguys.com. And so I write a column called Reading the Defense. And then over the off season, I write the column Reading the New Defense, which focuses on the impacts of scheme and player deployment on player value. And so I'm getting back into the flow on that idea with my Reading the Defense column now. And then the last week, I highlighted the Jets because they fired their coach and are searching to bring in new folks next year in 2025, which will alter their player value. So I took a look at that. The Jets are just, man, it's just, they're really in a spot right now, right? And there's some chatter about benching Aaron Rodgers. I mean, they're just the freaking wheels are falling off there. What I found interesting, just as a side about the Jets, is that they only allowed 5 tackles to opposing safeties last week, which is Nick Cross and Julian Blackmon. So 2 weeks ago, the last time they played, Julian Blackmon. Nick Cross, who had 14 tackles last week and 4 the week before. So if you're thinking about starting Seattle safeties against the Jets, take a deep breath. But anyway, so I'm probably right about the Saints and a couple other teams that we know we're going to see changes on in next year and how that might affect them, so the folks can begin to plan ahead. Either trade now, or if the trade deadline's passed, trade in the winter and get out ahead of some of these big value changes before they happen. Because that's like the one of the real challenges of IDP is to look how much these player values change over the offseason.
And do you think that's an overlooked part of IDP and player assessment, is what's happening with the underlying scheme? It should be one of the first things we consider, right? Especially when the takeaways from some of that evaluation are so clear and obvious in terms of what's going to happen with specific players.
I do, and in fact, that's why I started writing. Like several years ago, I've only been playing IDP about 10 years, which isn't as long as probably some other writers. But when I started, I was actually almost intimidated to get involved with it because I felt like everybody's going to know as much about defense as they do about offense. When I found that that's not the case at all, you get in these complicated IDP leagues and people really don't know defense. And so the first league I was in used 5 position IDPs. And what would happen is that in Dynasty, and what would happen is that there'd be a coaching change, a new coordinator would come in. And it was obvious to me that the defense was going to change from 3-4 to 4-3 or vice versa based on the hire. And what I realized is that like 2/3 of my league mates didn't know that. And so they were these really bad trade offers would go out in a flurry as soon as someone was hired, and people that didn't understand how the scheme would impact player position designations would be accepting, pennies on the dollar for players that, Khalil Mack was a guy that would bounce back and forth, or Chandler Jones was a defensive end for 1 year, but a linebacker for most of his time in conventional IDP leagues. And that's really kind of softened now. More formats are going to the true position or 2 positions, or but so you don't. That's not quite as big of an issue, which makes my job a lot harder. But I still think it matters. I still think that the scheme really impacts corner. Like the Saints are a great example, right? They have these outlier of tackle numbers for defensive ends and cornerbacks that you just don't see on other teams. And so I'll be writing about that. And so when they replace Dennis Allen and Joe Woods over the course of the offseason, it may be that they go to a more conventional scheme. And so the idea of Paulson Adeba being the top overall corner, which he was before he got hurt, is extraordinarily unlikely to continue because their scheme is probably going to be closer to the NFL average. It might not be, but odds are really high that it is.
Yeah, and to circle right back to the point we opened the show with, that linebacker spot, that's one where, being able to predict what that defensive coordinator is going to look like, his scheme's going to look like when he joins that new team is super key, right? And that they might not be deploying 2 full-time linebackers. A lot of coaches now don't. So being able to get ahead of some of those things, trading some of those guys who might seem to have a huge amount of value now under their current or in their current scheme before their value dips when everyone sees they're playing sort of 50% as opposed to 100% of snaps next year is huge, right? So that's kind of the reason why I like that you do what you do, Tripp. And I think if anyone's listening to this and isn't already subscribing and looking out for your work, what better reason to make sure that they are than to talk about this sort of stuff. So go and read Tripp's work. Go and subscribe to Tripp's work. He's a star, as has been apparent on this show. To our audience, you guys are stars as well. You guys rock. I so appreciate your support. You've been with us now for 13 weeks, almost 13 weeks, in fact. So if you aren't already, if you're new to the show, please subscribe to our channels. Make sure you don't miss out on any of our future episodes. We put out a bunch of amazing content pretty much every day now on the IDP After Show and the IDP Show. So please make sure you're tuning in on the daily. In the meantime, I wish you guys the very best in your Week 13 matchups. Happy Thanksgiving to you all. I'll be back next week to look at Week 14. Bye for now.
This was the IDP After Show.